From the National Catholic Register, this is Register Radio, bringing light and clarity to the news and topics that affect your life.
The United States Supreme Court wrapped up its term this week with rulings that could impact healthcare, abortion, social media, homelessness, and the power of the federal government. Joining us to look at a few key decisions is attorney Cristina Squiers. Then we turn to look at international religious freedom. I'm Jeanette DeMello, Executive Director of the National Catholic Register and Catholic News Agency. I'm your host here on Register Radio. Cristina Squiers is an attorney at Sher Jaffe who has experienced litigating high-stake cases at the trial and appellate levels in both state and federal courts. In the last 2 weeks, the Supreme Court has released its decision on several hot-button issues. One case that might not seem to have an obvious Catholic or religious connection is the Loper-Bright versus Raimundo case. And Cristina, this case, it's about fishermen. The Loper case was brought by fishermen challenging a federal regulation that said they were liable for the cost of federal inspectors on their boats. So the Supreme Court's ruling on this case really may be the most major ruling of the term. Why is that, and what's the significance of the court's ruling in the Loper case?
I think you're absolutely right that this is the most consequential case of the term because it really has nothing to do with the fishermen fishing. Right. The question that the Supreme Court was actually answering was whether to overturn a 40-year-old rule that said courts had to defer to how federal agencies interpreted the law and what powers those laws gave them. And so for the past 40 years, agencies have been able to make those interpretations and enact policies according to those interpretations. And now the court has said no more of that kind of deferring to their interpretation. The courts are the ones who will say what the law is, not the federal agencies. And so that has impacts for things ranging from the IRS and tax audits to how Health and Human Services enacts policies related to abortion services or transgender care and everything in between.
So, Cristina, this is really interesting because, as I said, it doesn't make sense so much on the face of it that this would affect Catholics, but the Little Sisters of the Poor, a Catholic religious order, filed an amicus brief on behalf of the fishermen. This obviously has to do with the HHS mandate, and so this is how that case basically relates to the religious sisters. They must have been ecstatic over this. So describe a little more what this case means for people like the religious sisters.
Yes, the religious sisters actually filed what's called an amicus brief or a friend of the court brief in this case, kind of detailing their 10-year saga fighting the federal government on a range of things, from the contraceptive mandate, as you mentioned, that was in the Affordable Care Act, to what transgender services are required. And so in those instances, you have mostly the Health and Human Services, but it could also implicate agencies like the FDA or the EEOC, who governs employment relationships. And what those agencies are mandating that employers do and nonprofits do and organizations do. And so the Little Sisters of the Poor explained kind of how they've been bullied by the federal government and their interpretations of these agencies into doing things like providing contraceptives or providing care adjacent to abortion, things like that. And for a long time, the court's hands were tied to defer to what these agencies thought the laws allowed them to do. And now their hands are no longer tied. The courts can step in and say, that's not what the law permits you to do. And that directly affects a lot of religious organizations.
Right. So this is really a huge win for religious liberty.
Absolutely. Our government, the way it was structured and created was to protect religious practice and religious exercise, particularly of religious dissenters or religious minorities. And as the federal agencies have become increasingly ideological, pushing certain agendas, particularly related to DEI issues, abortion, transgender, that has really limited what religious organizations can do to fight back. But now they don't have those limits imposed on them so much because courts can look at these with fresh eyes and not have to give that deference again to the administrative agencies and what their agendas are.
Right. So, we just celebrated Independence Day. It's the birth of our nation. We always take a look at the Constitution and just admire what it stands for at a time like this when we're celebrating July 4th. And so it strikes me that the Loper case hits at the core of how our government works. Isn't this just a refresher on the separation of power?
It absolutely is. One of the brilliant things about the way our government is structured and why it's been so successful is because there are three separate branches of government that do completely different things and are able to check each other, and the checks and balances, as we call them. And so what the Supreme Court did here was say, it's the function of the judiciary to interpret laws. And this doctrine that they overturned was letting the executive branch, the administrative agencies, do that. And so this opinion is really just putting each branch of government back in their proper place so that the checks and balance system can actually work.
Yeah, it's amazing because you often hear of these worries of an administrative state, and obviously this is putting that in its place. And Justice Roberts, in his opinion, rejected the suggestion that administrative agencies like we're talking about, should be the ones who are better suited to determine the ambiguities of what a federal law might have. But Kagan, on the other hand, Justice Kagan said that the court is now giving itself exclusive power over every issue. So it seems that even within the justices, there is still some major disagreement over the power of the court. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think what you're really seeing is a difference in how to treat precedent, meaning what the court has decided before. And so the three dissenting liberal justices really feel strongly that this doctrine has been around for a long time, and the administrative state has gotten so big. This is just kind of how the modern administrative state works. And the six justices in the majority were rejecting that, saying that even if that is the case of how it works now, it's not how the founders intended the government to function, and it's not how the separation of powers can be protected. And so to say that the courts are now being given the opportunity to weigh in on everything instead of administrative agencies, I think is not a fair characterization, because the court's job is to interpret the law, whether that law is about tax audits or abortion services. And just because these administrative agencies have professionals who have some expertise in these subjects does not make them experts in interpreting the law. The only experts in interpreting the law, as our government is set up to recognize, is the court.
Right. So I want to point to an article that's at ncregister.com. It's a commentary on this Chevron decision and the Loper case. It's titled Supreme Court Chevron Decision Restores Constitutional Order, written by Andrea Paciotti-Bayer. You're listening to Register Radio on EWTN. I'm Jeanette DeMello with my guest, attorney Cristina Squiers. And we have just about 3 minutes left, Cristina, and I'd love to talk about abortion and the abortion cases on this term, during this term. The Supreme Court issued a couple of cases. Some people in the pro-life movement characterize these as setbacks. Can you summarize quickly what the rulings were on abortion this term?
Yes, there were two cases. The first came out of Idaho. The federal government was suing Idaho, saying that their abortion restriction conflicted with a federal law that requires, under the federal government's interpretation, emergency rooms to provide abortion care in some instances. And the court ended up dismissing this case because the scope of the case had changed tremendously from the time that it was filed to the time that the justices would have been making their decision. So essentially they sent it back down for it to run its normal course through the court system before it would come back up for a final decision, given how shifting the issues were and the case was. The second big case was the mifepristone, the abortion pill, and that came up to the court after the full lower court review, unlike the Idaho case. But in this instance, they still dismissed it on somewhat of a technicality, saying that the doctors and organizations who brought the lawsuit were not the right ones to challenge what the FDA had done with the abortion pill, because they weren't personally injured by these abortion pill regulations.
So basically, these rulings, because they weren't on the merits of the case, but more on procedural questions and issues, the court's decisions on emergency abortion and abortion pill aren't likely to be the last words on those matters, right? So what do you expect to happen, or should we be looking at other cases like this coming soon?
Yeah, I expect both of these cases to be at the court in this even upcoming term that starts in the fall. So with the Idaho case, there's a very similar lawsuit pending on behalf of the state of Texas suing the federal government over the exact same issue, and that's already being briefed at the Supreme Court. And so I expect the court to take that case, and they will decide it on the merits, is my prediction. And then with the mifepristone abortion pill case, several states have intervened at the district court level, and so I think they will try to bring the case on their behalf instead of the doctors and the organization. So I expect that we'll see both of these cases back very soon with decisions on the merits for both.
So one last question. There's been so much talk about the court being partisan or ideological. How would you respond to that critique?
I would point people to the two abortion cases as a counter to that argument. And I think what you're seeing is these justices trying to restore the rule of law, trying to restore the separation of powers and these basic principles that make our government function successfully, not being ideological. I mean, they could have easily twisted some doctrines and gotten to the merits of these abortion cases, and instead they're very focused on the process and the procedures and what the rule of law requires. And so I think those two cases are great examples of how the justices are not being ideological, but following the rule of law.
Wonderful. Cristina, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Cristina Squiers was on EWTN News Nightly with Catherine Hadro on June 29th discussing these cases. You can watch that show on the EWTN app or on the EWTN News channel on YouTube. Up next, we'll talk to Register intern Catalina Scheider Galinanes about widening our awareness of international religious freedom. You're listening to Register Radio on EWTN. There's more when we return.
No prayer is useless. All prayer has power. If you say the rosary, it's real prayer because it's a mini scripture. If you say a novena prayer, it's a real prayer. It's just somebody there to help you when your mind is blank, to give glory and praise to God, to be humble and ask for whatever it is you want. All prayer is pleasing to God if it's done with a grateful, loving heart.
Let's return to Register Radio on EWTN.
Welcome back. I'm Jeanette DeMello, Executive Director of the National Catholic Register and Catholic News Agency. I'm your host here on Register Radio. You know, sometimes we aren't aware of the gift of our freedom, the freedom to have religious faith, to share it with others, to worship and serve others in the name of our faith. And so when that freedom is challenged, we wake up. And across the globe, that kind of freedom is challenged often, and it sometimes leaves believers very little recourse, any refuge from unjust laws or attacks. And so our Register intern, our news intern, Catalina Scheider Galinanes, woke up to the challenges regarding religious persecution in Pakistan during a recent story she was working on for the Register. So Catalina is our current news intern. She is a senior at University of Notre Dame, and she's studying constitutional studies as well as economic and political science. And, of course, she's getting some media experience with us. So, Catalina, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. I'm so excited to be here.
So, as I was saying, you were working on a story related to Pakistan, and basically there's a very small Catholic community there, and there are other minority groups, and these groups have faced violent persecution and discrimination for many years. Recently, the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan released a report highlighting this plight. What did they find?
Sure, yeah. So this report from the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan really drew a lot of attention to the oppression of religious minorities in Pakistan. So Christians specifically are just about 2% of the population. So there's about 4.9 million Christians out of the 245 million Pakistanis. The report drew attention to the strict blasphemy laws as well as the various incidents of violence, religious-based violence. So it's mob killings in addition to suicide bombings, but also more targeted attacks.
And so one of the things you write about in your story is that there aren't very many Christians who actually become public leaders. And obviously that's because of this discriminatory environment and very volatile environment for religious minorities. But there is a religious leader who was rather popular, Shabbat Bahati, and he was Catholic, and unfortunately he was eventually assassinated. You got to speak to his brother. So what is his story?
Yes, like you mentioned, it was really just shocking, surprising to hear about all of this that's going on around the world. But yes, so Shabbat Bahati was the first and only Christian cabinet member in the early 2000s, and he was receiving death threats even in 2009 surrounding the Asia Bibi case, which you may remember was a very famous blasphemy case. It's unique because it received international attention. She's a mother who was convicted of blasphemy and sentenced to death by hanging, and then she was imprisoned for 10 years. And Shabbat Bahati, as a Catholic in government and in this position, advocated for her and against these strict blasphemy laws. And it was for this advocacy that he was assassinated in 2011. So I was able to speak with his brother, Peter Bahati, who has then gone on to begin an organization in Canada, International Christian Voices, which focuses on helping Pakistani Christians fleeing from their nation and from this persecution. So speaking with him was really just an amazing experience. And being able to have these interviews and speak to people that are so close to the issue is something that I've really, really loved about my internship here. Not only speaking with experts, but also, people with these personal connections.
Right, and it's amazing because Shabbat Bahati is now a servant of God. I mean, his case has been recognized as the church as a martyrdom. It's really amazing that you got to speak to his brother. You know, that personal connection. Sometimes we think of these martyrs as people in the very, very distant past, but they're not. I mean, they're martyrs today, and this is one of them. And he's not the only one, really. I mean, there's another servant of God that you were able to write about. Can you talk a little bit more about the 20-year-old?
Yes. So, we have these contemporary martyrs. The other Pakistani Christian who is also in the running to become the first Pakistani saint is Akash Bashir, who he was killed just at the age of 20. He had been working as a volunteer security guard for his parish in the Diocese of Lahore. So that in the Punjab region is really where most of the Christians in Pakistan are concentrated. And the churches had been receiving threats of Islamic terrorism, and so they had asked for volunteers, for young men to guard the churches, and he responded to that call, knowing the danger, and then he was faced with a suicide bomber, and he prevented him from entering the church, and he was tragically killed, but he sacrificed himself for the over 1,000 Catholics who were attending Mass inside. So it's such a young age to really provide this witness to Christ and to the church. I was really so inspired. That's really where my interest in the Pakistani church came from, was learning from his story.
Absolutely. Peter Bahati mentioned to you, and you wrote about it in the story, that there were 25 places of worship in 2023 that were attacked, and that's a huge number. I want to point people, Catalina, to your story on ncregister.com. It's called "New Report Publicizes Plight of Christians in Pakistan." This is Register Radio on EWTN. I'm Jeanette DeMello. I'm speaking with the Register's news intern, Catalina Scheider Galinanes, and we're talking about just kind of waking up to the plight of Christians throughout the world. And Catalina, as you talked with me before the show, but just talking about your increased awareness of Pakistan's plight, and how did this affect you? I know it made you dive deeper, but are there other ways that this story affected you?
Yes, no, certainly. It also drew a lot of attention from me of the universality of the church and the global nature of the church and the connection that we have with all of our Catholic brothers and sisters around the world. And of course, how easy it is to take for granted our freedom of religion and our ability to practice our faith without fear of imprisonment, of death. And yeah, just responding to that call to pray for persecuted Christians around the world and to get involved in advocating for them.
Absolutely. Let's talk a minute about what these blasphemy laws are. I mean, that's why so many people have been imprisoned. But Catalina, as you discovered, the claims sometimes are very bogus. What are the blasphemy laws? What are the types of allegations these people are facing?
Sure. So the blasphemy laws, and specifically the blasphemy laws in Pakistan, they really create the worst environment for religious freedom. It's specifically in Pakistan, it's applied in a way that anything that can be considered as offensive to a Muslim or offensive to Islam is punishable by these extremely harsh imprisonments. But something that was really shocking, and I found this out while I was interviewing and investigating, is that many times these claims cannot even be repeated. So in court, it can't even be said what they're being accused of. Mm-hmm. They do not require evidence. They're completely baseless. These are completely baseless claims, but with real repercussions. So even just 2 weeks ago, on May 25th, a 72-year-old Christian man was killed in Pakistan, and they arrested a huge mob of over 100 men for his death. He's an elderly man who had been baselessly accused of blasphemy, and his home was attacked. So there's really hundreds, thousands of these cases.
Right. I mean, again, reading your report, reading the report that was put out by the commission, you realize that because the government will put these people in prison for like 10 years or something, sometimes the mob doesn't want that. They want immediate action. And so then you get the mobs, mm-hmm. which is immediate death. So it's an extremely volatile situation. What is being done to help it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of Christian groups that are trying to bring attention mm-hmm. to this. And even recently, even the United States State Department in their 2023 report on the state of international religious freedom brought attention to it. But yeah, and then there's also, as I mentioned, Peter Bahati's group in Canada is doing a lot of work on the ground to allow or facilitate Pakistani families to flee mm-hmm. and to flee to Canada and to places which are safer to be a Christian. He said that they had already helped to resettle about 200 individuals. But there's a lot of work to be done to
Absolutely.
Make Pakistan a safer nation for Christians.
And prayers, right? We have to pray.
Mm-hmm.
So before we end,
yeah.
I want to ask you, you're doing this internship at EWTN News. You are studying mostly politics and things like that. What is your interest in journalism?
Sure. I think I was really drawn to journalism and to EWTN specifically because of the importance of the truth. And I see reporting and writing, especially on these topics, as a way to communicate the truth about what's happening in our world, and also the truth of our Catholic faith. And yeah, I think it's a beautiful thing, and it's also a way to be involved in political conversation as well, to gather information on current events and to be able to present it.
Absolutely. I think it's a tremendous opportunity to witness to the truth, as you've said. And so I thank you so much for your work, and I hope that you continue to learn and to share what you're discovering with the world through your writing. So thanks so much for being with us on Register Radio.
Thank you so much for having me.
Again, you can find Catalina Scheider Galinanes' work at ncregister.com, especially this story on the plight of Pakistani Christians. And of course, there's a lot more news, analysis, and commentary at ncregister.com. Thanks for joining us here on Register Radio on EWTN. Together with Matthew Bunson and my producer, Michael McCall, I'm Jeanette DeMello, and until next week, I pray that God bless you.